Raza has just stepped out for a minute, but we are waiting now for Peggy to speak, and Peggy will, she's been waiting very patiently. We kept her. Peggy, did you enjoy this beep? Did you expect it?
Did I enjoy the what?
The beep. The exercise with me.
Yes, very much.
Right. So can we kindly ask Peggy to make her presentation and speak a little bit?
Sure. Is this a good place to make it from?
Yeah.
Okay. So Rosa set a very challenging topic for me that I don't know whether that's going to work well at the end of the day, for you've all had a very busy day of planning. But he asked me to talk about the importance of inner work for the GSN, and in particular for people working on the issue of slavery in the world. So I'm going to take it first from a difficult perspective and then from a positive perspective. So we'll end with the more positive. The difficult one is the following, in my view. Slavery represents the shadow of humankind in the world. And it's not surprising that it's there, because we all have individual shadows within ourselves. What I've learned after 32 years of working with Synergos is that unless we do the inner work, which for the moment we're going to talk about the shadow aspect, which is the deeper and more complicated aspect of it, we are at risk of somehow participating in the shadow of the world. Because the shadow that each of us carries, and I'll explain what I mean by shadow in a minute, is always there ready to attach itself to the shadow that's out there in the larger world. If, as we all hope, we're going to be able to stand in the face of that external shadow, we need to understand, and yes, I would say, accept our own shadow. So let me just say a few words about what I mean by shadow. And this is from a psychological perspective more than perhaps others. When we're young, we're told by a caretaker, a parent, or whoever, don't do that, or that's bad. And in our young selves of 2 years old, 3 years old, 5 years old, we often feel that that means that we are bad. So whatever it is we've been castigated for, we sort of freeze, we're afraid, we may be angry, but we stuff it down because it's unacceptable. And we come to believe that if we are that way, we are bad, and therefore we will not be loved, and therefore we can't do that anymore, because at the age of 2, 3, or 4, that's too scary. So we go on accumulating in our young lives, and some of us more than others, obviously, depending on the degree of the trauma, episodes where we were told we were bad and we internalized it and stuffed it down. Now, it takes a lot of energy to stuff this down, because what we do is we drop it below the level of consciousness. And so what happens, almost inevitably, we use all this energy, which, by the way, detracts from our creative energy, but it gets harder and harder as there gets to be more and more to keep it stuffed down. So guess what? Every once in a while, we have an explosion or an eruption, something where we wonder, after that's over, how could I have done that? That's not me. And it's like that energy leaking out. Now, if you want to know the parameters of your own shadow, one of the best ways to find out about it is to think, who is the person who irritates you most? Or what is the behavior that just really triggers you? You just can't stand it. And I'm sorry to tell you that that is likely what you're suppressing. It's a pretty awful thing to think about, because, I mean, I know that the people who irritate me most, they really irritate me. And, I mean, I'll just give you a personal example to make this real and also to make myself vulnerable, which is I was brought up not to boast, not to be center stage. I was one of 6 children. There wasn't enough love and attention to go around with 2 busy parents. And so when people try to take all the attention, it just makes me so mad. Well, guess what? That means I really want all the attention. So of course I love being in this situation, but I'm not going to admit that. So this is sort of the personal aspect of it. And if we can look at it from the perspective that we were little children when that happened, we were not bad people. And that which can often grow into a monster in the way that it's hidden from us can seem really horrible. I'm going to give you a couple of examples, again, without going into detail, of how I discovered some of my shadow aspects. I had a dream one time about a killer bull he was out of my reach in the dream and was about to kill a woman. This was a horrifying dream, and I actually worked on it for a number of months. And I realized that inside me is a killer bull. And that in order to, and that's not an easy thing to come to terms with, that there's an aspect of me that really wants to kill someone. And so in order to come to acceptance of that, I had to really do a lot of work and a lot of what we call voice dialogue with myself to take ownership of, okay, here's this almost demonic force. And by the way, it came from my maternal lineage, which is weird because it seems like a masculine thing. We won't get into that right now. But to come to terms, to set limits. And I'm not going to go into the process now, but that's just an example of sometimes these shadow forces can seem to be really awful. In fact, they can seem to be as awful as the people who are engaging in slavery. So that's my argument for unless we understand our own inner shadows and really come to terms with them, it's going to be more difficult for us to stand in integrity and consistency against that kind of behavior in the world. So now for the more positive part, and I'll conclude on that. I've been thinking a lot about, okay, what keeps us from being our best selves? And a lot of it, again, is related to trauma that almost all of us inevitably face at some point in our lives. Sometimes it's very young as children. Sometimes it's terrible things that happen to us later on. And the trauma tends to generate one of at least three results. One is fear. And fear definitely stands in the way. It makes us want to hide. We don't want to risk. We don't want to be big. We don't want to be seen because we're terrified. A second is shame. When we've been shamed as children, it makes us feel like we don't deserve to exist. It is one of the most crippling things that happens as a result of trauma. And a third, I would say, is rage, which in some ways is almost the more healthy of the three because the reaction to what might have happened to us, it's good to get it externalized. On the other hand, if we haven't really processed it and it just sort of plops out all over, it's not very healthy or useful. So I've been thinking about what are the ways in which we can do the inner work which will allow us to overcome that. And the retreats that Rosa keeps talking about that we do in Montana, I think are an example of what we've developed as one way of doing it, and I'm sure there are lots of ways. And it's often, I think, best done in a group where one can create a safe container where within the group there are certain guidelines that people adhere to about confidentiality, et cetera, that lead to allowing people to be vulnerable about what are the things that are impeding their being the best leader that they could be out there in the world. And as they begin to get vulnerable and admit to some of those things, to themselves but also to the group, it opens other people's hearts. So here I'm referring to open-hearted versus closed-hearted. And the work that we're trying to do requires our being open-hearted, even in the face of seeing terrible things. So as the vulnerability happens and people begin to build trust in each other in the group and in themselves because they get positive feedback for being vulnerable, which means they're actually being authentic, which means that it's easier for other people to trust them because they've dropped their mask and the other people can actually see who the real person is. And by the way, when you see almost any real person for who they are, how can you help but love them? You know, when they're behaving vulnerably and they're open. And that then leads to a sense of belonging, which opens us to curiosity and imagination and creativity, which is, of course, absolutely necessary for emerging into solving huge problems like this. And then that really allows us into a sense of flow in which we're using that imagination and creativity to then come into sort of the third spiral of this. It's all in a paper that I wrote that's online at synergos.org called Building Trust Works, which then leads to compassion and love and gratitude and connectedness with something larger than ourselves, which is what ultimately will hold us when those old traumas come up again and again to haunt us, because they do. They never fully go away. So it's an iterative process. It's not just a one-time fix. But to the extent that we create a community such as this one, and in that community are able to build that kind of trust, which allows us to continue to both experience the pain of recognizing our shadow or dealing with our fears or our shame or our rage, and then move on beyond that to be what I would call the best bridging leaders, because a lot of this has to do with bridging across divides, and it needs to be much more than the people in this room, of course. And once we are trustworthy, because we've gone through that process, once we open to our creativity, and once we are imbued with a sense of gratitude and compassion and love, even if we then fall off that and, return to some insecurity, we have a community within which we can re-find our center, within which we can move forward again together with the support of other trusted people. So that was my reflection when Raza asked me to talk about why the importance of inner work when dealing with such a difficult and complicated externalization of the global shadow. Thank you.
Thank you, Peggy. Would anybody have any questions to ask Peggy on this subject? Because this morning when we started off, we talked about the importance of everything else we are doing. But if we don't have true consciousness and compassion, and we can keep our ego aside for the love of humanity and not thinking that my way is the right way, I think that's the only way for us to make progress. And I'm really grateful to Peggy for taking this time out and sharing with us what she does and how she can help. If anyone has any questions, oh God, I just thought that'd be one. All right, Peggy, I'm out. We have a mic. Does anyone have a mic?
Yes, thank you for that. It was very, very earlier today. Raza and I were talking this morning about the need for a reset in consciousness, in our beliefs, first in ourselves and who we are as we sit at table or in any organization seeking to make these changes and being the bridges. How do you address the issue of measuring that? So the other, activities that we're responsible for in organizations, we have metrics for. But this metric for being a conscious individual, empathetic, compassionate, and self-evolved to some extent first, difficult to measure. How do you address that?
Oh, yeah. So, yes, very difficult. And obviously, this doesn't quite fit in sort of the measurement and evaluation categories that we usually talk about in terms of impact. I think when you talk about it within an organization, it's pretty easy to observe how the organization is functioning, what the level of trust is that then leads to people raising difficult issues, dealing with conflicts as they come up. and resolving them in a way that allows the organization to move forward. It probably would be difficult to determine what aspects of that relate to good management versus increased consciousness and the members of the organization or the group having done their inner work. So it's not a very good answer, but that's as good as I can get.
Just talked about is having been in this issue for 10 years and having, met survivors and struggled with my own rage. And, could you bring what you do in your retreats in some mini form to us? Because I think that would create a lot of profound trust and really help the synergies that are already beginning to deepen and drop into, our hearts with each other much deeper.
So, this is in a way, it's part of Synergos' purpose. Our larger purpose is to help the world multiply the number of really good bridging leaders who can address serious, complex issues in a collaborative way. And part of what gets you there is to do the inner work. So we can take that request on. Reza's on our board. Daniel leads our Global Philanthropist Circle. And we could have dialogue about how we could help with that.
That's a good suggestion. I think if I just have some sort of an indication with raise of hand, that would it be, we haven't had a chat, so I think we need to do a lot of logistics and discussion internally within GSN and with Peggy and Synergos. If we were to suggest some sort of a retreat for GSN members, which would mean sparing a week, can I just have a very rough idea how many on this group may be interested to look at? So more than 10? Okay, just an idea. All right, thanks.
This comes out of talking with Michael Wendt and Valerie, who were just with you in Montana. You changed their lives in the retreat that they were just in, and it was really inspiring talking to them after they returned from working with you. So thank you for your work in the world.
I think your story and the shadow reference is something that needs to be communicated to a larger audience, and in our communication as individuals to people we're trying to get involved with the subject. I think that's a very good way to connect humans on a very psychological and at the core of humanity, right? What the problem that we're facing right now is a large issue, and it has a lot of negativity, and it's hard to tackle sometimes in general consumers' minds. If you bring it back to the core existence of the individual and this shadow idea, it's a connective tissue, I think, that can be communicated at a much easier level and consumable level when we're talking about leveraging social media, when we're talking about communicating clearly to get people more involved. A lot of times the subjects are hit right with, here's what's wrong, and here's the people being affected, and we're the storytellers, but we're not telling why we're involved. I think you have just encompassed the reason why each individual can see themselves in another person's shoes. And in communicating clearly with younger generations especially, I think that should be considered a manner in beginning the conversation and starting the narrative from GSN to broaden our reach. So thank you.
Yogi, you were saying something, or? Yes.
Hi. This is a very personal question to Peggy, very personal. This whole day has been of learning, and everybody here has learned a lot. But in the last half an hour, I was very, very intrigued as to the calmness and the serenity with which you spoke, and the humility and the humbleness. I would like to learn that from you, because I think that I'm a very achieved person, and my ego comes in the way every 5 minutes. And you, being so great, and you're so very calm and wonderful. Tell us more about this.
Very personal on your part, Yogi. And I really appreciate that. And at some future time, I'm happy to have that conversation.
Thank you very much.
I think there was one question over there, and I think we'll move on from there. Yeah. Last.
Peggy, I admire your leadership in every aspect, in so many ways. But if you can share maybe 3 steps you have taken to really move towards that personality you've grown into, the journey you've taken, what were the things the steps you've taken to be who you are today? What has been inspiring to you that has helped you in your journey to be the leader you are today?
Well, I can say something very briefly, and it relates to what I said generally. Finding a community of trust where I could allow myself to be vulnerable and to express the pain and trauma I've had in my own life so that I could look at it openly and feel supported by others. That was a huge, huge thing. And accepting the fact that I carry, this is surprising because I know I come across as so calm, and actually I did feel very calm when I was talking. But accepting the fact that I will live with chronic anxiety my whole life, and that it comes and goes, that it's never going to go away, and that actually what helps alleviating it is a message I got a long time ago, which is serve with love. And when I feel like I'm serving with love, I feel like I'm in my center and I don't have to feel anxious.
Thank you. Okay. All right.
I just want to recommend Peggy's TEDx talk, which is wonderful, and goes a little bit deeper into some of these things.
That's a very good suggestion. Thanks. Moshe has started this tradition that we have a moment of silence, because after this discussion, I would ask Moshe to please request for that. And then after that, Bishop Alistair is going to do the summary and the closing.
So thank you, Peggy, for the introduction, for inner work. So it's just a suggestion, it's a proposition.